All right, so good afternoon and welcome to the Zoom webinar for the 2020-2021 Fair Housing Notice of Funding Availability for the City of Fresno HUD Entitlement Programs. This presentation will include an overview of the program, discuss federal and threshold requirements, and also cover the application process. Today we are joined by Austin Robinson, Contract Compliance Officer for CDBG Public Services. And I am Edward Chinevere, Senior Management Analyst for the Housing and Community Development Division for the City of Fresno. Unfortunately, Karen Jenks is indisposed and will not be able to join us today, but you'll be able to reach out to us with questions. We'll begin today's agenda with a program and planning overview to explain how we got to the point of releasing the NOFA that we'll be discussing today. That will include a description of the types of services we're accepting applications for. Then we'll go on to discuss some of the more technical aspects, including eligibility, threshold, and federal requirements, documentation and monitoring for subrecipients, and an overview of how reimbursements are processed. Finally, we'll go over the application and process and leave some time for questions and answers. We'd like to start the overview today with a bit of an explanation for how we got here. HUD entitlement programs involve a robust planning process which guides the way investments are made in the community. We'll quickly cover the CDBG entitlement programs and the planning efforts that were conducted for the current annual action plan, consolidated plan, and analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. Those are essentially the planning documents that are required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development that lead us to the activities that we ultimately release these notices of funding availability to request applications for. And they do sort of guide a little bit how we, the types of activities we're requesting and other aspects. So we'll go over that a little bit. The City of Fresno is an entitlement jurisdiction, and that means that it receives funding through 4 formula grants from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is commonly referred to as HUD. Formula grants are determined through census and other data that calculates community need according to a complex formula which determines the size of the grant available for the jurisdiction. The size of the grant can increase or decrease based on changes in population, demographics, the number and size of other jurisdictions participating in HUD programs, as well as federal funding levels. The funding is provided to primarily benefit low and moderate income persons through affordable housing and community development. The city operates many programs to meet HUD objectives utilizing these funds and also makes additional funds available to the community through notices of funding availability. The notice of funding availability for fair housing programs is the subject of today's conversation. While the planning activities associated with the HUD entitlement grant programs encompass 4 distinct grant programs, the fair housing activities which are part of this NOFA are funded from the Community Development Block Grant Program, also known as CDBG. CDBG funds projects, programs, or services to benefit low and moderate income persons. The CDBG program has the largest list of eligible activities among the grant programs that we administer. The city prioritizes those activities through an analysis during the planning process, which includes robust citizen input. The city uses CDBG funds for infrastructure and facilities improvements in low and moderate income neighborhoods, operates a housing rehabilitation program, and operates programs for seniors and youth out of city-owned community and neighborhood centers. Additional funds are made available for eligible organizations to apply for. We'll now talk briefly about the required HUD planning process. This year is a consolidated plan year, which means that the city has just concluded its 5-year planning process for the entitlement programs as required by HUD. This has an effect on both this year's priorities and the timeline, which are both different from in more recent years. The 2020 to 2024 Consolidated Plan was approved by the City Council on May 21st, 2020, and sets the priorities for funding over the course of the 5 years of the plan. As part of the planning process, the Annual Action Plan was also completed. The Annual Action Plan essentially serves as the city's application for annual funding in accordance with its 5-year plan. The Annual Action Plan this year, since it was completed as part of that consolidated planning process, does not include specific subrecipient information as it has in years past. Rather, it contains funding at the project level, and that project is defined by the Annual Action Plan with a HUD definition, which really translates to something more like project types, because each of those projects that are included in the Annual Action Plan may include one or more subrecipients and subrecipient activities. Now that the City Council has adopted the Consolidated Plan and the Annual Action Plan, we're in the green area on the diagram displayed here. The city issued Notices of Funding Availability, or NOFAs, starting in May, and requested applications from eligible organizations for activities that meet the objectives of the individual projects approved in the Annual Action Plan. The planning process continues after the awarding of subrecipient agreements because we do require accomplishment reporting back from our subrecipients to the city, which then in turn informs the city's progress report to HUD, which is called the CAPER, or Consolidated Annual Performance Evaluation Report. We'll go over the specifics of this timeline in a bit more detail toward the end of the presentation. As discussed previously, program year 2020 to 2021 is a 5-year plan year, which means that applications are being requested to meet the priorities in the 2020-2024 Consolidated Plan. Projects were approved by City Council on May 21st, and applications for specific activities that are eligible for those projects are now being requested through this Notice of Funding Availability. Multiple applications may be approved for funding for the project. The project that was approved as part of the 2020 to 2021 plan, which is included in this application, is Action Plan Project number 16 for fair housing, described as support for fair housing outreach and education to ensure fair housing opportunities. $50,000 of CDBG entitlement funding is being provided for this project. When the city was discussing the priorities for funding under the entitlement programs with members of the community during the consolidated planning process, it became very clear that fair housing initiatives were a priority to residents. For this reason, the city's 2020 to 2024 Consolidated Plan includes the provision of services to residents and housing providers to advance fair housing as a standalone priority for the first time. This is further defined as fair housing education services to help residents, community organizations, and housing providers understand fair housing rights and responsibilities, as well as legal assistance in the prevention of eviction. In 2020, the city also updated its analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, or AI, which is an assessment of socioeconomic conditions, segregation and integration, access to opportunity, housing profile, including publicly supported housing, housing for persons with disabilities, and fair housing activities. The AI also identifies barriers to fair housing choice within the city and provides recommended activities to address those barriers. The city has prepared a list of AI recommended activities it wishes to address through this NOFA, which are presented in the subsequent slides and fall into one of three categories: fair housing complaint and referral services, public fair housing education and outreach, and fair housing education and outreach to housing industry professionals. We'll now go through these activities in more detail. The city will award 1 point for each activity included in the application, and a second point for each activity for which the organization has at least 1 year of experience providing a similar service. The city may make multiple awards in order to cover as many of the recommended activities as possible. The first area which the city is requesting applications for is fair housing complaint and referral services. The city is requesting applications for providers of the following activities: accepting fair housing calls and investigating complaints in multiple languages. Strongest applicants will also provide an accessible means of contact for members of the public, including telephone, email, and touch-to-type. Investigation and referral of complainants to the appropriate services and organizations. Providing support in multiple languages to include Spanish and Hmong. Tracking of complaints by zip code, gender, race, and ethnicity. And tracking outcomes of complaints by type, to include those referred to legal services, code enforcement, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, HUD, or other outcome types. The second activity category is public fair housing education and outreach, which includes the creation of a public fair housing education program to include actions and timeframes for educating the public regarding their fair housing rights and means by which they may report cases of housing discrimination or seek advice pertaining to those rights, those fair housing rights. The creation and distribution of materials to promote fair housing rights to the public. Those materials should include both print and digital communications, to potentially include a web page hosted by the organization, or recommended updates to the city's fair housing web page, printed flyers or brochures to be distributed in city facilities and other public locations, social media posts and email distributions. And the city is interested in applications that demonstrate an in-depth knowledge of the best means of reaching low and moderate income residents, especially persons of color and other populations potentially vulnerable to housing discrimination. The distribution of fair housing resources through local agencies is also included, such as social service agencies, community organizations, local congregations, or any other channels that the applicant proposes would be most effective to reach the populations. Additionally, collaboration with local agencies serving immigrants, refugees, and populations with limited English proficiency on fair housing education, such as local agencies serving immigrants, refugees, and other populations with low English proficiency, to collaborate on approaches to provide fair housing education and enforcement for these groups. Strong applicants for this item will commit to attending meetings of the city's Immigrant Affairs Committee to keep apprised of the emerging needs and best means of reaching these populations. Also, publicizing new state requirements regarding accepting Section 8 vouchers to the public and voucher holders to include collaboration with the Fresno Housing Authority to raise awareness among voucher holders and public, and also increasing awareness of subsidies and resources in low-income neighborhoods by targeting those neighborhoods with high proportions of low-earning workers as priorities for interventions that increase awareness of available subsidies and resources. And finally, going back to the first bullet point with this last one here, updating the public fair housing education and outreach program by providing a summary of actions and outcomes following its implementation, to include recommendations for improvement in subsequent years based on emerging best practices and any implementation experience that the organization may have had in the implementation of the program for the plan year. The third and final category of activities is fair housing education and outreach to housing industry professionals. And this category includes providing resources, communicating stakeholder responsibilities, including digital and print materials that communicate fair housing responsibilities of landlords, property owners, property managers, and lenders. Publicizing new state requirements regarding accepting Section 8 vouchers, this time to landlords and property owners, with a focus on independent landlords not affiliated with larger property management companies. Publicity to potentially include partnership with media outlets and housing agencies and connecting landlords with questions regarding the new law to the appropriate resources to answer those questions. Creating and leading workshops with local lenders to improve mortgage lending outcomes for applicants of color by convening a working group of local bankers to identify collaborative steps the city, lenders, and other local housing agencies could take to both increase the completion rate of loan applications and to reduce the denial rates. Then summarizing and distributing key issues and recommendations made at those workshops to both the attendees of the workshops and to the city. And finally, annually convening housing industry professionals to learn about fair housing rights and responsibilities through a community-wide event or partnership with an existing event, such as a fair housing conference, either in person or virtually, that convenes housing industry professionals to learn about fair housing rights and responsibilities and updated fair housing laws. This event should be publicized broadly to industry professionals, including lenders, housing agencies, landlords, property owners, and property managers. Next, we'll discuss some of the eligibility, threshold, and federal requirements that are required. Now, these are both required. Mainly, a lot of these things will apply aside from the threshold and eligibility requirements. Some of these requirements will apply after you've received an award, should you receive an award. But we really want to make sure that that you're aware of some of these before you apply. In summary, agencies must meet the threshold criteria listed on this slide. If an agency cannot provide documentation to demonstrate that it meets all the criteria, the application may not be considered for funding. These include that the application is submitted by an eligible entity, which has completed the Part A and Part B applications, including all of their required attachments. These applications are presented in a single form for the Fair Housing NOFA. The application must be consistent with the consolidated plan priorities, the annual action plan Fair Housing Project, and include the recommended activities from the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, which we've just discussed. Activities and expenses included in the application must be eligible for funding through the CDBG program, and the organization must have adequate financial and management systems in place. And we'll go through each of these items in more detail in the next slides. Eligible entities are units of local government serving program beneficiaries residing in the city of Fresno, or a nonprofit corporation that is incorporated in California or within a state of the United States, the District of Columbia, or a United States territory, which is also properly registered as a foreign corporation with the California Secretary of State, which also possesses a 501c3 determination of exempt status. The city will accept an advance determination ruling from the IRS for this item. Fair housing is a CDBG administrative activity, and HUD regulations provide that fair housing activities are eligible, including the provision of fair housing services designed to further the fair housing objectives of the Fair Housing Act by making all persons, without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, or handicap, aware of the range of housing opportunities available to them, as well as other fair housing enforcement, education, and outreach activities, and other activities designed to further the housing objective of avoiding undue concentrations of assisted persons in areas containing a high proportion of low and moderate income persons. So the reason we really highlight this is because if you're familiar with other CDBG funded activities, as an administrative activity, fair housing is a little different. So this language is pulled directly from the regulations from HUD. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's not eligible on the next slide. So generally, the following types of activities are ineligible, many of which probably wouldn't be included in a fair housing application, but we'll list them here. And these include the acquisition, construction, or reconstruction of buildings for the general conduct of government, political activities, certain income payments, so those would be transfer payments to individuals or subsistence payments with some exceptions, and the construction of new housing, again with some exceptions. Again, we know that a lot of these things wouldn't be necessarily relevant to this type of activity, but we will list them here and refer you to the regulations later in the presentation as well if you have any further questions. And like I said, HUD regulations governing eligible activities are very complex. The references on this slide are from the HUD Exchange, which is a digital repository of useful information for grantees and subrecipients. These will provide more information on what may or may not be eligible for funding through the CDBG program. And a note, this presentation will be posted as soon as possible following this presentation. So you should be able to just click right on these links once we have that posted on the website. Next, we'll discuss some of the strings attached to the federal dollars. If you've worked with the CDBG program in the past or any federal grant program, you know that there are a lot of hoops you have to jump through in order to document that you're using the funds in the manner in which they were meant to be used. And a part of our role and job with the city is to document that and make sure that everything is in the file. So we want to make sure you know before you decide to put a lot of work into applying for these funds, everything that comes with receipt of these federal dollars. We're going to go over written policies and procedures, the environmental review process, special conditions for procurement, property and asset management, audit requirements, and record keeping. So we'll get started with written policies and procedures. As a condition of receiving these funds, you will need to have written policies and procedures in place in order to run the program you'd like to be funded. If you've worked with federal grant programs in the past, these are the same set of rules across a lot of different federal agencies. These requirements are under 2 CFR 200 of the federal regulations, often referred to as the Uniform Administrative Requirements. And this is really just a quick introduction to what's there. And if you want more information on what needs to be in your policies and procedures, please reach out and we can try to guide you in the right direction. But most importantly, your policies and procedures have to be written, especially your financial management standards. A large part of that is internal controls, meaning segregation of duties. We need to know you have proper guardianship and control over any assets you have, the processes and making sure that your records are accurate and timely. And if you haven't done this yet, if you're a smaller agency and you've not yet pulled together written policies and procedures, this might be a good exercise for you to lay out those strategies, to lay out those things that you do not do on an everyday basis. The procedures don't have to be hundreds of pages long. They can be simple bullet point lists What we really need to do is ensure that you have policies in place and know how it all fits together. Your policies should also cover your procurement. 2 CFR 200 lists out the procurement policies that you need. Keep in mind that a lot of these guidelines are broad, which means that they're meant to cover many programs. So what you'll find there are bare minimum standards. The requirements lay out how to do a free and open competition. For example, if you're buying a pack of pencils, the requirements are going to be different than if you're trying to acquire a new building. There will be different guidelines in 2 CFR 200 depending on the type of procurement that you're performing. Cost principles, what we're talking about here is basically supporting what is eligible and allowable under the administrative requirements, but also about the line items underneath those. For example, if you pay for a staff person, what kind of records you need to keep in terms of timesheets and payroll. Another part of that is direct costs versus indirect costs. So if you're not familiar with what's allowable and what's unallowable, 2 CFR 200 is a good resource, or you can always give us a call and we'll provide you any kind of guidance you need. Most of the things you're looking for in terms of property, equipment, staff salaries, paying the utilities, those things are going to be eligible, but if you have questions about that, please let us know. Property standards include maintaining your property, and if purchased with these funds, there is a period of time that you need to use that real property for eligible CDBG activities. We'll touch on record keeping and audit requirements a bit more later in the presentation. This next slide shows a selection of program policies we think any program we're funding is going to have in place. Again, you don't have to have these all laid out by the time you apply, but once you do receive your award, these are the things that you should have pretty soon thereafter. Applicant intake and eligibility determination is one of the big things for these federal programs. And here I will pause to note that the Fair Housing Project is currently funded from the city's administrative funds for the CDBG program, which means that some of the beneficiary eligibility requirements are not applicable. However, the reason that we're really pointing it out here is that the city may choose to use non-administrative funds for this purpose in future years. So it's important to know that CDBG funding requires that the majority of beneficiaries are at or below 80% of area median income, and that the subrecipient has procedures in place to document that, and that those that documentation is available for the city to monitor when we come to monitor the program. But again, for this funding cycle, since we're using CDBG administrative funds for this, it is not required that you maintain that income documentation. We're just pointing it out because in the future, that may be different. Again, fair housing activities. Apologies, got a little lost here. The rest of these policies are straightforward. Equal opportunity and non-discrimination is of course critical. If you are a faith-based organization, we might want to take a closer look to make sure you're eligible and you'd be allowed to apply for these funds, since there are restrictions on mixing religious activities with the funded programming. Conflict of interest policies should absolutely be in place, which should address disciplinary actions for failures to abide by the conflict of interest policies. If you have a parent organization or a subsidiary, you have to address that relationship as well. And finally, if you do have any conflict that appears, or even the appearance of a conflict of interest, as one of the clauses in the subrecipient agreement, which you'd be executing as the city, should you receive an award, you would be required to notify the city of that conflict. As federal funds, every single dollar that the city uses is subject to environmental review. For social services like fair housing, the environmental review is very simple and very easy. It just takes a few days, but the city does still need to conduct that review. And the important thing for you to know is that no activities completed before the environmental review is completed are eligible for reimbursement. For capital improvement projects, the environmental review is much more involved, so please make sure in the future, should you ever be involved in capital improvement projects funded with CDBG dollars, to remember that the process is much more complex than this one for social services. Procurement, minority and women-owned business outreach. So the first item here, prevailing wage rules, that is primarily associated with capital projects. So wouldn't really apply here given that this is social services funded. But these other three are important. Minority and women-owned business outreach. You'll need to document the outreach and other efforts to make sure that when you do any type of procurement, you're making sure that any qualified women-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses are aware of the opportunity and you give them a fair chance to participate. The regulation in 2 CFR 200 has a section on minority and women business outreach and things you can do to make those procurements more accessible to them, including which types of procurements this applies to. Section 3 is a requirement that where there is a contractor involved and they're going to need to hire more employees or subcontractors in order to complete the scope of work that's being funded, they must try to maximize to the maximum extent feasible job opportunities for lower income people in the project's area. The city currently partners with an organization helping others pursue excellence, or HOPE, who does Section 3 training. So if you have an opportunity, we could always connect you with HOPE to see if they've trained any people or know anyone who would be able and willing to partner with whatever contractors you select. And this is what they call a cross-cutting requirement, where if you're hiring contractors, Section 3 will always apply. While it doesn't strictly apply to every single procurement, and for the exceptions, you can refer to 2 CFR 200 again, but 2 CFR 200 does include language asking that this is applied to the maximum extent feasible. So we want to extend that, and really, if there are job opportunities for lower income persons due to this type of work funded with these programs, we want to make sure that those opportunities are made available to them, again, to the maximum extent feasible. Finally, anytime you work with a contractor, you must do a debarment suspension check on sams.gov. All you do is you go to the website, search for the contractor you want to work with, and if they're listed, you won't be able to use them. You'll have to go on to your next lowest qualified bid. If they aren't listed, you just print out the piece of paper that shows that they're not listed, that they're not debarred, and then you maintain that in your file, again, so that it's available for the city when it conducts its monitoring. With regard to property and asset management, while real property won't apply to activities that are funded with this NOFA typically, equipment could potentially. And this comes into play if equipment is purchased which costs over $5,000. It must be used to meet a HUD national objective activity for a minimum of 5 years and be insured. You also need to have controls in place to make sure that you're monitoring the use of that equipment and making sure it's being used for the same purpose as the city originally funded it for. So that means you're going to have some sort of inventory control to prevent against loss, theft, and other policies to make sure that it's continued to be used for that same original intent. Next, we'll talk about audit requirements. Anytime you spend more than $750,000 in a single year, you will be subject to the audit requirements of 2 CFR 200, which means you'll need to select an auditor to perform that audit, either on your organization or on a single program. And upon completion of that audit, you would submit it to the city, You would submit it to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and if the funded program had any findings, the city would then have to follow up on those findings. If you are below that $750,000 threshold at the end of your fiscal year, you'll simply submit a letter to the city saying for the fiscal year that you did not reach the $750,000 threshold of federal expenses that would have required that audit. Record keeping is one of the bigger areas which causes monitoring findings. Often agencies do everything right, but the agency might not have the best records, the proper records to show and document that they did everything correctly. So good record keeping would include having project file checklists, having an extra set of eyes go through all your record keeping, and it takes some extra time, but in the end it's worth it to make sure that you never have to repay these funds. Some record keeping notes to keep in mind: one, make sure that all your record keeping, especially personally identifiable information, is subject to safeguards. It must be in a locked office or a locked cabinet, and there should be controls around which people in your organization have access to those files, and that same would apply for electronic files as well. We will note that if you are collecting a lot of personally identifiable information, the city will also be looking at your insurance requirements to make sure that you have adequate coverage for any kind of liability there. In terms of how long you need to keep the records, you'll need to keep them for at least 4 years after the closeout, except in circumstances where the record retention may actually be longer. That would be when you're purchasing property or improvements, as we discussed previously. Also, if there's any outstanding monitoring or litigation, the record retention requirements would also be longer. These will all be clauses in your subrecipient agreement. Should you be awarded funds, you'll have to provide access to the city and any designated officials from HUD or any other federal agencies that need to look at those files. And with that, I will hand it off to Austin Robinson, who will walk you through the documentation requirements and monitoring. And Austin, just let me know when it's time to advance the slide.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. All right. Yeah, now we're going to talk a little bit more about documentation requirements and monitoring requirements. Go to the next slide. All programs funded will be monitored by the city for compliance with city and HUD requirements and regulations. Program requirements, including performance, accomplishments, eligibility, and expenditures, will be included in desk review or remote monitoring, and also on-site monitoring reviews. The city will provide technical assistance as needed or requested to assist the grantees to track program progress and success of efforts. If the agency is not following the program requirements and the federal or state regulations, then the funding may be terminated and funding reimbursement would be required. Most of the in-person monitoring is an extension of the desk review. This includes ensuring general record keeping, like mentioned before, is adequate. For example, if beneficiary files are maintained electronically versus hard copies, confidential information is stored in secure locations with limited access, or determining which accounting system an organization uses are just some examples. Upon awarding an organization, a quarterly performance report is required by the agreement upheld between the city and the subrecipient. Subrecipients are required to provide quarterly performance reports within 30 days from the end of each quarter for all funded activities. Data that will be included in the quarterly report includes racial and ethnic data, income data, homeless status, and assessment of performance. Additional requirements may be included based on the nature of your application. Reports of beneficiaries must be of unduplicated household or persons assisted. And again, the quarterly report template will be emailed to all grantees at agreement signing. When monitored, again, either in person or during our desk reviews, we will review your program policies and procedures, which must be written down. Each subrecipient must maintain compliance with their national objective for activities classifying under low to moderate income beneficiaries. Verification and eligibility determination must be maintained and approved. Procurement policies of services and supplies, conflict of interest policies, equal opportunity, and non-discrimination policies must also be provided and maintained. Similar to the general policies and procedures, financial policies and procedures must be written down and include internal controls, determinations of allowable costs, payment processes, and of course, audit requirements. It's important that you record whether you are subject to the federal audit requirement, and if so, that audit or documentation of exemption is made available to the city. On the financial procedures slide, we've outlined 3 key questions that should be asked to make cost determinations. First, are costs allowable? And to that end, you'll submit a budget to the city with your application. If the city approves your application or approves it as amended, then those costs should be allowable if you stick to the budget. Second, are costs reasonable? Meaning what a prudent person would pay. Good procurement policies and records would support this. Finally, are all costs allocable? Meaning are expenditures directly related to the funded program? And for costs split between programs, the split and rationale for the split are clearly documented. Next, we'll talk about the reimbursement process. Programs funded with these federal dollars are reimbursement only, meaning that no funds are provided upfront. Rather, subrecipients submit documentation of allowable costs, and those costs are then reimbursed by the city, which then the city will receive reimbursement from HUD. Again, the reimbursement process entails a transfer of grant funds to the subrecipient based on actual expenditures by the subrecipient incurred before the request for funds. The request is then reviewed by city grantee staff who will determine if documentation such as receipts, invoices, canceled checks, etc. are sufficient or whether additional documentation is needed. Reimbursements are processed within 30 days of receiving a complete reimbursement package. We would like to stress that reimbursement package are only considered complete after all requested supporting documentation has been received and approved by the city. Next, establishing and maintaining a financial system, both that serves your agency's needs and meets federal requirements, is essential to avoid overspent budgets or serious audit findings. We've discussed many of the required elements previously, but we'll stress again the importance of internal controls, accounting records, documenting allowable costs, and having appropriate procedures for those, source documentation and retention, budget controls, and cash management processes, as well as financial reporting. Details of each element can be found on the HUD Exchange link listed on this slide, which will be available on the city's website following this webinar. And back to Ed, just gonna conclude our little presentation for the application process and any further details.
Oh, sorry, I had myself on mute there. Thank you, Austin. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure.
There's a little slight like breeze in the back, I believe. I'm not sure if it's AC or something.
All right. Yep, it's probably my computer running.
Okay, yeah, it's fine. I still hear you clearly.
All right, great. So, so like Austin said, we'll go over quickly the application process, timeline, and resources available to you during the application process. So first, how to apply. The application process is presented in detail in the 2020 to 2021 Fair Housing NOFA Handbook, which is available on the website of the Housing and Community Development Division under the tab Notice of Funding Available. To the right, you'll find links to all of the application materials included in the 2020 to 2021 Fair Housing NOFA. The first link, circled there in red, is the handbook, which contains much of the information provided in this presentation and more. It's strongly recommended that prospective applicants read that handbook in detail prior to beginning the application. And then below the Fair Housing NOFA handbook, you'll find the Fair Housing NOFA application. That is a fillable Word document. So you'll just open that up in Word and complete that, and then you'll submit that to us, and we'll go over your submission options a little later in the slide. The first part of the NOFA application is called Part A, which every organization must complete along with all of the required attachments. For this one, we've provided that list of some of the required attachments here, as some of these may take a little more time for eligible organizations to collect. These include things that you probably already have on hand: 501c3 IRS determination of exemption letters, articles of incorporation, bylaws, statement and designation by foreign corporation if you're an out-of-state corporation, your list of directors and officers, most recent audited financial statements, cost allocation plan. So this is really if an applicant is seeking to charge an indirect cost rate greater than 10% of modified total direct costs. Those are typically total direct salaries. If you have another methodology that you use for allocating indirect costs and that's documented and you're using that on your application to request that those costs be reimbursed, then we need to be able to see that plan so that it's clear how you're allocating those indirect costs according to the program components. If you're not, then that's not required. And finally, a resolution of your board of directors authorizing the submission of your application and naming the person or persons authorized to sign the application. We know that one might take a little bit longer for you to acquire. So for that one, that one's required by September 21st, 2020. The application Part B includes all of the information regarding the specific program components for which you're asking funding. And organizations may submit one or more Part B applications. In this case, for fair housing, pretty much everything is on the same application, so you should just need to submit one document. Some of the required attachments for this application, which may take some time for you to collect, include a program level operating budget summary. As we discussed earlier when we were talking about financial management and allowable costs, it's really important that that program level operating budget has enough information on it for us to verify that the costs that you're requesting as part of the program both make sense for the are reasonable for the type of program that you're operating, as well as that those types of costs are eligible under the federal entitlement program. So that program level operating budget summary is very important. Prior year program funding, prior year program level financial statements are also required for existing programs. And service area maps are required unless you're able to adequately describe the service area for your program in the application narrative. Applicants should also submit any funding commitment letters received for other sources of funding for your program. And you're also encouraged to attach up to 2 letters of support, additional letters of support beyond the first 2. Will not be considered when we're reviewing applications. On this slide, we have a tentative timeline. I will stress the word tentative here. We're reasonably confident in the dates presented here, but there's always unknowns that can come up when we're working through the processes of local government and through federal regulations. especially in this time with the coronavirus pandemic. But we're reasonably confident in this timeline. Applications are due to the city on September 4th, 2020. The city will then score those applications upon receipt based on the criteria that is explicitly listed in the application. So we really stress the importance of taking a look at that scorecard that's included in the NOFA application document itself, so that you can really make sure that you prepare the strongest application possible. If there's information in that scorecard, it's a really good idea to make sure that you back that, provide examples that demonstrate how you meet that criteria in the 2-page program description that is allowed in the application. So once the city has scored the application according to that scorecard listed in the application, those scores will then be presented to City Council for consideration. And then resolutions authorizing the application are the next thing in the timeline. And like we said before, those are due from applicants on September 21st, 2020. And the tentative date for City Council consideration is September 24th, 2020. Following that, the city will then enter into subrecipient agreements and begin environmental reviews. I should note here real quick, this year's timeline was impacted by not only the fact that it is a 5-year consolidated plan year, but also by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result, we're making every effort to move as quickly as possible. However, note that the city will not enter into a subrecipient agreement until it receives a funding agreement from HUD for the 2020-2021 program year. This has been a very, very busy year for HUD, since a lot of the coronavirus relief funding has been channeled through them. But we're pretty hopeful and pretty certain that the funding agreements will be in place well before the September City Council meeting. Applications are due by 4 p.m. on the submission deadline of September 4th, 2020. On account of the COVID-19 pandemic, organizations are asked to only submit digital copies of their applications. Organizations have 2 options for submitting digitally, which include emailing hcdd@fresno.gov or using the city's FTP upload tool, that's File Transfer Protocol. That tool, detailed instructions, step-by-step instructions for using that tool are included in an appendix to the Fair Housing NOFA handbook. But it's pretty straightforward. You go to the link listed in the appendix, you'll upload your document, and then the system will give you a link. And this is the part that's really important. You have to make sure to copy that link and paste that into an email, which you will then send to hcdd@fresno.gov. If you don't copy and paste that link and email it to us, we don't receive any notification that you've performed the upload. So that, make sure to follow those instructions step by step should you use that FTP upload tool. And the reason we provide that tool is that if your attachment is over 40 megabytes, we can't receive it in the city's email system, so then you'll need to use the FTP upload tool. I think most people, though, in my experience, have applications that are well below that 40 megabyte range. So the easiest thing for you to do is probably just to go ahead and email it straight to us. Once you submit your application, we strongly recommend that you contact us. If you do not receive confirmation, you can reach us at hcdd@fresno.gov or give us a call at 559-621-8300. We will attempt to contact you within 24 hours of receiving your application, but it's probably not a bad idea for you to go ahead and send us an email, like I said, with your application, and CC the support person for your application, who in this case is me. So additional support is available. Applicants may schedule one-on-one consultations for the period from August 21st through August 28th. So please contact me in advance to schedule any consultation. I'll probably ask Austin to help me out with those, as Austin has a lot of experience with the day-to-day operations and requirements of these programs. But you can meet with us from August 21st to August 28th, and we can provide one-on-one technical support. So please just make sure to send us an email, edward.chenevere@fresno.gov, to schedule a one-on-one consultation, or for general inquiries, you can go ahead and email hcdd@fresno.gov. We also recommend that you bookmark the Notice of Funding Availability tab on the Housing and Community Development Division website, and check back often there for updates. We will post any questions that we receive along with answers to those questions. We'll make those updates typically on Tuesdays and Fridays. If we don't have any questions, then obviously there won't be an update, but it's a good idea to bookmark that tab and check it often for any updates. And again, the address for that is fresno.gov/housing, and then look for the Notice of Funding Availability tab. If you're looking at it on a PC, that'll be on the left-hand side of the screen where you'll find that Notice of Funding Availability tab. And then just go ahead and bookmark that page. Again, email, another thing that's a really good idea, if you are not already receiving emails from the Housing and Community Development Division, we send out public notices with opportunities for the public to participate in our planning activities, as well as information about potential funding activities through this mailing list. So if you're not already receiving those, please make sure to email hcdd@fresno.gov and request to be added to the HCD distribution list to receive updates on planning activities. You could actually just go ahead and shoot an email over to HCDD with the word join in it, and we'll know what to do with that. With that, we will thank you. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to email us. You can either email myself directly, edward.chenevere@fresno.gov, or you can email hcdd@fresno.gov. And as I said before, we'll post questions and answers to an FAQ that will be posted up on our website located under that Notice of Funding Availability tab. So with that, thank you for joining us, and we hope to hear from several of you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
All right, did I